The wilderness doesn't call your name when you breach its borders. It doesn't care for the stories you've told yourself to sleep at night, the half-remembered losses, the dreams you've let calcify, the brittle shell of a life you've pieced together with trembling hands. It's a vast, unyielding sprawl, sand ancient as the bones beneath it, stone sculpted by winds that moan secrets they'll never yield, air that presses against your chest with a weight older than language. Some wander into it seeking refuge, a balm for wounds they can't name. Others crawl out with fragments of their soul snagged on its thorns, lost to shadows that don't forgive. I've gathered this thread, not to untangle its snarls, but to let its echo linger, too loud to smother, too jagged to bury. This isn't a tale spun for a shiver by the firelight. It's a splinter of truth, carved into the marrow of a man who stepped into the wild and emerged with something fractured inside. Or perhaps didn't emerge at all, not as he once was. My own name fades here. I'm a collector of the unseen, a scribe threading this voice through a tapestry that quivers with dread, its edges fraying under the weight of what's been glimpsed. What matters is what he touched, what he heard, what lingers in the tracks and the dark. A question that claws at your thoughts, relentless as a beast gnawing bone. One man, Grant Latimer, crossed that threshold, driven by a quiet hunger for solitude, blind to the hollow that pulsed beneath the trails he thought he could chart. His story isn't a fleeting whisper. It's a slow, spiraling plunge into the desert's unseen depths, a descent where the sand holds its breath, the shadows stretch with intent, and the earth itself seems to listen. This is his unraveling, a journey into the echoes of the hollow earth, and perhaps a mirror for you if you're bold or foolish enough to gaze into its depths. Grant Latimer, the desert's pale hunger. The air in the Anza Borrego Desert State Park in the spring of 2012 was a furnace against Grant Latimer's skin. A dry, merciless heat that seared his lungs with every inhalation, thick with the faint, acrid bite of baked sand and the resinous tang of creosote bushes, their scent clinging to his clothes like a persistent shadow, sharp and bitter against the back of his throat. At 34, he was a freelance cartographer, a man who lived by the lines he etched into existence. Mapping trails through forgotten stretches of wilderness, plotting contours on maps that curled at the edges from sweat and dust, gathering data for outdoor enthusiasts who craved the wild but preferred it tamed, neatly packaged in guidebooks and GPS coordinates. These trips were his sanctuary, a way to sever the cords of a world that buzzed with emails, phone calls, and the relentless hum of obligation. A world where deadlines loomed like vultures and his rented apartment in San Diego smelled of stale coffee, mildew, and the faint regret of a life he'd let slip into monotony. He arrived at the park's edge just after dawn, a spark of anticipation flickering in his chest, a quiet thrill that pulsed beneath the weight of routine as he shouldered a pack heavy with water bottles that sloshed faintly against his spine. A GPS unit clipped to his belt, its plastic casing scratched from years of use, and a notebook where he sketched paths with a pencil worn to a stub, its lead smudged from the press of his fingers, its pages yellowed and curling at the corners. The landscape unfurled before him, surreal and boundless. An endless expanse of ochre sand rippling under a sun that hung low and unforgiving, its light a harsh glare that bleached the world into stark relief. Jagged canyons sliced the earth like the scars of some ancient cataclysm, their walls a tapestry of reds and browns layered with striations from centuries of wind and water, their shadows pooling cool and dark against the dunes. Isolated palm oases shimmered in the distance, their fronds trembling like mirages against the heat-hazed horizon. Green smears against the arid sprawl that seemed to mock the idea of life thriving here. The silence was absolute. A stillness so profound it pressed against his ears like a physical force, a void unbroken save for the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the brittle, sun-scorched ground and the rasp of his breath, sharp and uneven in the dry air that coated his tongue with dust. He wore a faded flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbows, the fabric damp with sweat beneath the straps of his pack, and a pair of boots broken in from years of trails, their soles grinding sand into fine powder with every step. His hair, dark and matted beneath a wide-brimmed hat, clung to his forehead, and his hazel eyes squinted against the glare, scanning the horizon with a practiced ease that belied the restlessness stirring beneath his calm. No one knew his precise route, a fact that loomed in hindsight like a specter over his steps, a quiet recklessness he'd worn like a badge of freedom, a defiance against the tether of civilization he'd come to resent. The first few hours unfolded in a rhythm he'd honed over countless expeditions, a cadence as familiar as his own heartbeat. Tracing shifts in the terrain with a cartographer's eye, noting how sandy washes glittered with animal tracks. Coyote prints weaving erratic trails through the dust, their faint claw marks a whisper of life in the desolation. The occasional bobcat leaving sharper, more deliberate impressions, their paths vanishing into the scrub where brittle branches snapped underfoot. His pencil scratched against the notebook's pages, the sound a faint counterpoint to the desert's hush, its graphite tracing lines that mirrored the land's contours. Dips where the sand had pooled after rare, fleeting rains. Rises where the earth buckled into low ridges crowned with jagged rock. Shadows where the sun's reach faltered, leaving pockets of cool that smelled faintly of mineral and decay. His mind was quiet, focused, the task a meditation that dulled the edges of a life he'd left behind. Clients who haggled over deadlines with clipped voices. An apartment where the hum of a refrigerator was the loudest company. A past he'd buried beneath layers of maps and trails, its details blurred like ink smudged by rain. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher, its heat a relentless weight that pressed against his temples, drawing beads of sweat that traced rivulets down his neck, soaking the collar of his shirt. Around noon, the pattern fractured. He paused at the mouth of a narrow canyon, its entrance a shadowed gash in the landscape, its walls rising sharply on either side, a claustrophobic corridor of stone that funneled the heat into a stifling embrace. The rock gleamed faintly, striations of sediment pressed into its surface like the rings of a felled tree, a history written in hues of rust, ochre, and deep brown, their edges worn smooth by winds that carried no sound today, their silence a stark contrast to the faint moaning he'd heard on other trips, a lament that seemed to rise from the earth itself. There, cutting across his path, he spotted a series of prints, deep, deliberate, pressed into the sand with a weight that made the surrounding dust crack and curl inward, as if the ground had yielded reluctantly to their maker. The stride was wide, 5-6 feet between impressions, too broad for a coyote's skittering gait, too heavy for the lean bobcats that prowled these wastes, their tracks typically shallow and precise. He crouched, the sand gritty against his knees, and ran a finger along the edge of one print. The grains cool beneath his touch despite the sun's glare, the impression crisp as if stamped moments ago. They reminded him of ostrich tracks, long, splayed, with toes that fanned out like a bird's, each tip ending in a faint, blunt curve. But the thought was absurd. A flicker of unease he dismissed with a shake of his head, a wry twist tugging at his lips. Ostriches didn't roam California's deserts. Nothing that large and avian belonged in this arid sprawl, where life clung to the edges with a stubborn, skeletal tenacity. The prints were larger than his own boots, size 11, worn and scuffed, and deeper, sinking an inch into the earth, their edges sharp against the wind-smoothed sand. Curiosity stirred, sharp, insistent, a thread woven into his cartographer's soul, a hunger to map the unknown that had driven him into the wild time and again. He followed them, partly because they veered toward the trail he'd intended to chart, a faint path he'd glimpsed on satellite images weeks before, partly because they whispered a challenge he couldn't resist, a puzzle etched into the desert's skin, begging to be solved, its answer lurking just beyond the next bend. The tracks wove through a maze of slot canyons, their walls closing in with every step, a labyrinth of stone that swallowed the sky into a narrowing ribbon of pale blue overhead. The striations gleamed in the slanting light, layers of sediment stacked like the pages of a book no one could read, their colors shifting from blood red to burnt sienna, a testament to floods and winds that had carved this place over millennia. The air thickened here, grew staler, a faint metallic tang creeping into his nostrils, sharp and unsettling, like rust left to fester in damp corners, a scent that didn't belong in the bone-dry desert but coiled in his gut nonetheless. The sun's rays thinned into slivers, piercing the canyon's depths with a harsh, golden glow that cast jagged shadows across the sand. Shapes that danced at the edges of his vision, tricks of light he told himself to ignore, though their flicker tugged at the corners of his mind like a memory he couldn't place. His boots scraped against the rock, the sound echoing faintly, a hollow rhythm that matched the thudding of his pulse. Louder now as the silence deepened, pressing against his ears like water at the bottom of a well. He couldn't shake the prickling at the nape of his neck, a sensation that crawled down his spine like the brush of unseen fingers, the sense that eyes watched from the crevices above, that the desert held its breath around him, waiting. He paused, ear cocked to the stillness, his breath ragged and shallow, the faint rattle of his gear shifting against his back a reminder of his solitude in this alien sprawl. Nothing, just the hiss of his own exhalation, the distant hum of blood in his ears, a silence so complete it felt alive, a presence that wrapped around him like a shroud. He adjusted his pack, the straps cutting into his shoulders, and pressed on, the tracks a steady guide through the maze, their impressions growing sharper, more defined, as if their maker had lingered here, its weight sinking deeper into the sand with every step. The canyon twisted, its walls narrowing until he had to turn sideways at points, his shoulder brushing the stone, the coolness of it seeping through his shirt, a fleeting relief against the heat that clung to his skin like a second layer. By late afternoon, the trail led him to a shallow ravine that shouldn't have existed, a tear in the desert's flesh his map refused to acknowledge. He pulled the crumpled sheet from his pack, its edges curling tighter from the damp of his hands, its surface smudged with graphite and streaked with dust. He traced the coordinates with a trembling finger: 33.25 degrees north, 116.40 degrees west. A seamless plain of sand stretching unbroken to the horizon, a flat expanse marked only by the faint outline of a wash he'd passed hours ago. Yet here the ground had collapsed into jagged, uneven sections, a chaos of broken stone and displaced earth, as if the desert had buckled under some unseen force, its surface fracturing like glass under a hammer. The air hung heavier, the heat pressing against his temples like a vice, a throbbing that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He folded the map, tucking it back into his pack, and stepped into the ravine, the sand giving way beneath his boots with a soft crunch that echoed faintly against the walls. At the ravine's base, he found a sight that twisted his stomach into a cold, tight knot. A mangled coyote carcass sprawled among the rocks, its ribs cracked open like the pages of a book flung wide, its chest a hollowed cavern where flies buzzed in thick, frenzied clouds, their wings a shimmering black hum in the fading light. The kill wasn't fresh, the flesh still clung taut to the bones, its fur matted but intact, the eyes clouded white in a stare that seemed to follow him. Yet it hadn't decomposed, the desert's aridity preserving it in a grotesque tableau that glistened faintly with the sheen of drying tissue. He knelt, the sand gritty against his knees, and leaned closer, the stench hitting him like a wave. Rancid meat, sharp and sour, mingled with that metallic tang that lingered in the air, a cocktail that turned his stomach and forced a dry gag from his throat. Something about the bite marks gnawed at him. Jagged, uneven, not the clean precision of a predator's jaws but a savage rending, as if the creature had torn into it with reckless abandon, its teeth or whatever passed for teeth, leaving gashes that splintered the bone beneath in ways that spoke of brute, chaotic strength. He traced the wounds with his eyes, the edges ragged, the ribs snapped inward like twigs underfoot, the spine twisted at an angle that defied the animal's natural form. A mountain lion might have done this, he reasoned, lean, powerful, a hunter that struck with surgical intent. But the marks didn't align. They lacked the symmetry of a cat's bite, the neat punctures of fangs designed to kill and feed. A bear, perhaps, wandered far from its range, driven mad by hunger. But no, the desert didn't harbor bears. Not here. Not in the sun-bleached waste where water was a rumor and shade a fleeting gift. The tracks he'd followed led straight to it, their deep impressions circling the carcass in a deliberate ring before continuing deeper into the ravine. A path that beckoned like a dare, a thread of evidence he couldn't ignore, against the quiet voice of caution murmuring in his skull. Turn back, mark it, leave it. He pressed on, the canyon narrowing until the sky above was a thin ribbon of pale blue fraying into dusk, its edges bleeding into a bruised purple that swallowed the light. The air grew claustrophobic, thick with that metallic tang, a weight that pressed against his chest and coated his tongue with a film he couldn't spit out. Every sound amplified, the crunch of his boots against loose gravel, the faint clink of his water bottle against his pack, the rasp of his breath catching in his throat, louder now as the silence thickened around him. His GPS flickered when he checked it, its screen glitching with static, lines of green and black dancing across the display. Before going dark, the battery dead despite a full charge that morning, its power drained by some unseen hand. He cursed under his breath, a low "damn it" that echoed faintly against the walls, and tucked it into his pack, pulling out his compass instead. Its needle steady in his palm, glinting faintly in the dimming light. A lifeline, he told himself, though the weight of it felt frail against the desert's vastness. A child's toy in the face of a world that didn't bend to human tools. He could retrace his steps, map the route back. He'd done it before in worse conditions. Blizzards in the Sierras, fog-choked forests along the coast. His memory a grid he could navigate by feel if needed. The thought steadied him, a thread of reason to cling to as the tracks veered sharply into a cave mouth. A low, jagged opening nearly hidden among the rocks, its edges scarred with faint drag marks that trailed into the sand like the strokes of a careless, heavy hand. He stopped, crouching at the entrance, his shadow stretching long and thin across the ground as the sun dipped lower, its last rays painting the canyon in hues of amber and blood. The darkness inside was absolute, a void that swallowed his gaze, refusing to yield even a flicker of shape or depth. A black so dense it seemed to pulse with its own life. The air wafting from it was damp, cool against his sweat-slick face, a stark contrast to the desert's heat, laced with that same metallic stench. Wet rust, sharp and sour, a smell that coiled in his gut like a warning, tugging at some primal instinct he couldn't name. He peered in, squinting against the black, his flashlight still buried in his pack, its beam a temptation he resisted. To pierce that dark felt like an invitation, a step too far into a place that didn't want him, a violation of an unspoken boundary he sensed but couldn't define. The cave wasn't on his map, an omission that tugged at his cartographer's instinct, a blank space in the grid of lines and numbers he'd spent years filling, a void that whispered of secrets the desert had kept from him. He knew better than to wander into it alone. No rope to mark his path, no partner to pull him back, no signal to call for help if the earth swallowed him whole. He'd read the stories. Cavers trapped in unmapped tunnels, their bones found years later, their screams lost to the stone, and prided himself on the caution that had kept him alive through a decade of wandering. Yet the silence inside stirred something. A faint rustle, a shift of shadow that might have been his imagination or might have been alive. A sound so subtle it hovered at the edge of perception, teasing him with its ambiguity. His hand hovered over his notebook, pencil poised to mark the spot. Latitude, longitude, a hasty sketch of the entrance. But the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. The lead scratching an uneven scrawl across the page, a jagged line that Miro read, the unease creeping through his veins. He stood, brushing sand from his knees, and stepped back, the cave's mouth a dark eye watching him retreat, its stillness a weight that pressed against his chest, urging him to turn away. That's when the desert went quiet, truly impossibly quiet. The wind that had sighed through the canyons all day, a faint moan he'd barely noticed until it stopped, fell still. Its absence a weight that pressed against his ears, a void that thickened the air into something he could feel on his skin. No distant bird pierced the hush with a cry, no lizard skittered across the rocks with its dry, rasping tread. Nothing but the thud of his own heart, loud and insistent in the silence, a drumbeat that echoed in his skull like a warning. He turned, slow and deliberate, scanning the ravine, the walls looming closer, their striations blurring into a tapestry of menace as the light bled away, the shadows pooling into shapes that flickered at the edges of his vision. Tricks of dusk, he told himself, though the lie tasted thin, bitter on his tongue. Movement caught his eye. Something large, pale, darting between two rocks at the ravine's edge. Fast, unnaturally fast. A blur of motion that vanished before he could fix it in his gaze, leaving only the sand and the silence in its wake. He whipped around, sand crunching under his boots, his breath hitching as he searched the emptiness. Nothing, no trace, the ground undisturbed save for his own tracks, their shallow impressions mocking his solitude. Then he saw them. A second set of tracks, weaving erratically alongside his own, wider now, deeper, their edges crisp as if pressed into being while his back was turned. a fresh scar on the desert skin that hadn't been there moments ago. His pulse spiked, a drumbeat that thundered in his ears, drowning out the silence. They were longer than the first, the toes splayed wider, sinking 2 inches into the earth, a weight that spoke of mass, of power beyond anything he'd imagined. He crouched again, tracing their shape with a trembling finger, the sand cool and unyielding beneath his touch. They weren't just walking. They were stalking, looping around his path in a tightening spiral, a predator's dance etched into the dust with a precision that chilled his blood. The realization hit him like a cold wave. They hadn't been there before, as if whatever left them had waited, watched, chosen this moment to reveal itself, its presence a shadow cast across the sand without a source. The desert pressed in, the heat heavier, the walls closer, their striations blurring into a smear of red and brown that seemed to pulse in the fading light, a living thing that tightened its grip around him. He stood, starting back the way he'd come, his steps quick but measured, careful not to run. Not yet, the instinct to flee warring with a fraying thread of reason that whispered, "Stay calm, stay sharp, don't give it the chase it wants." The silence thickened, a shroud that clung to his skin, and with every step the air grew denser, the metallic tang sharper, coating his tongue like a film he couldn't spit out, a taste that lingered like blood or rust or something older, something the desert had birthed in its depths. His pack jostled against his back, the water bottles sloshing faintly, a sound that grated against the stillness, a reminder of his fragility in this vast, uncharted sprawl. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see nothing, half dreading what might be there. The cave mouth receding, its dark eye still fixed on him, the tracks a silent promise trailing behind. Then it came, a sound, wet and ripping, followed by the unmistakable crunch of bone, sharp and deliberate, echoing from behind like a gunshot shattering the stillness. His breath caught, a ragged hitch in his chest, and he turned, slow as a man trapped in a nightmare, his eyes drawn back to the ravine's heart, the air thickening around him like a noose. There, hunched over the coyote carcass he'd passed, was a thing his mind refused to name. A wiry, massive shape, its pale skin stretched taut over ribs that jutted like a cage, its frame a grotesque patchwork of 2 long limbs and clawed hands that gleamed faintly in the dusk, their tips crusted with dirt and shadow. Its back was to him, its spine a knotted ridge of bone beneath that pallid hide, flexing with every movement, and it tore into the carcass with a savage precision, ripping chunks of flesh with those claws, swallowing them whole, its motions jerky, wrong, like a marionette cut from its strings, animated by a force that defied nature's design. His brain scrambled for a comparison. A hairless bear, perhaps, starved and twisted by the desert's cruelty, its fur stripped away by disease or time, but that didn't fit. The limbs were too elongated, dangling past its knees when it shifted, the spine too flexible, bending in ways that mocked the rigidity of bone, the proportions of blasphemy against anything born of this earth. It turned, and he froze, his legs leaden, his breath a shallow gasp trapped in his throat, his mind a chaos of denial and dread. Its face was a nightmare, canine yet warped, the jaw stretched too wide, a gaping maw lined with teeth that jutted at odd angles, some broken, some sharp, a chaos of ivory stained with dark streaks that glistened wetly in the fading light. Its nostrils flared, slits in that elongated snout, sniffing the air with a hunger that pinned him where he stood, a predator's instinct honed to a razor's edge. The eyes, God, the eyes, were pits of black, no reflection, no light, just voids that seemed to drink the world around them, their gaze locking onto him with a weight that crushed the air from his lungs. Its head snapped toward him. A jerk too quick, too precise, a motion that defied muscle and bone, a machine-like twitch that spoke of something ancient, something that had adapted to this hollow earth. And for a moment they locked, a standstill where time thickened into a suffocating weight, the desert holding its breath around them. His mind screamed, "Run, run now," but his body betrayed him, rooted by a terror older than thought, a primal recognition of something that didn't belong, something that had waited in the dark for eons, patient and inevitable. The thing dropped the carcass, the thud a dull echo against the stone, a sound that reverberated through the ravine like a drum roll, and started toward him. Slow at first, its claws scraping the rock with a sound like nails on glass, a grating screech that clawed at his ears, then faster, its loping gait unnatural, a predator unused to 4 legs but adapted to the chase, its body swaying with a grotesque fluidity that turned his stomach. Grant turned and ran, the sound of those claws a relentless rhythm behind him, a staccato that drowned out his ragged gasps, his boots pounding the sand with a force that sent jolts through his knees. His pack dragged at him, a dead weight slowing his stride, water bottles clattering, the notebook jostling against his back, the GPS unit long forgotten. And he tore it off, letting it fall, the crash of gear against sand a fleeting distraction he didn't dare turn to see, its loss a sacrifice to the desert's hunger. The canyon walls blurred past, their striations a smear of red and brown, the sand stinging his eyes as he pushed forward, legs burning, lungs searing with every breath, the heat a furnace that baked his skin even as the light faded into a bruised twilight. It gained ground, its breaths heavy and wet, a labored hiss that curdled his blood, a sound that vibrated through the air and lodged in his chest like a splinter, a guttural rasp that wasn't animal, wasn't human, but something older, something that belonged to the hollow beneath the earth. He veered toward a rock face, its surface gritty under his palms, and scrambled up, hands slipping on loose stone, boots scraping for purchase, his fingers raw and bleeding as he hauled himself onto a narrow ledge, the pain a distant echo beneath the roar of adrenaline that drowned his senses. His chest heaved, sweat blinding him as he pressed against the wall, the cool stone a fleeting relief against his back, his shirt clinging to his skin, soaked through with the salt of his fear. Below, it paced, its massive frame a pale smear against the dusk, its head tilting in a grotesque, almost curious arc, as if studying him, weighing him, its claws clicking against the rock with a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Then it unleashed a sound, a deep, guttural hiss, low and resonant, a vibration that clawed at his skin and rattled his bones, a noise that wasn't a roar or a scream but a declaration, a claim staked in the desert's silence, a voice that echoed from the hollow earth itself. His stomach lurched, while rising in his throat, and he didn't wait, kept climbing, hands tearing against jagged edges, the pain a white-hot pulse he forced himself to ignore, his nails splitting against the stone as he dragged himself higher, the ledge giving way to a steep incline that burned his thighs with every step. He crested the top, the desert sprawling vast and empty before him, a sea of sand and shadow under a sky bruising into night, the stars faint pinpricks against the black that offered no comfort, no guide. It didn't follow or couldn't, he didn't know. But he ran, boots sinking into the dunes, legs buckling under the strain, his breath a ragged hymn that tore at his lungs, each gasp a plea to a world that didn't answer. The sand shifted beneath him, a treacherous tide that dragged at his feet, slowing him until his muscles screamed for rest, his vision blurring at the edges with spots of white and black. He collapsed beneath a Joshua tree's gnarled branches, its twisted limbs a skeletal canopy against the stars, their thorns glinting faintly in the moonlight like teeth bared in silent warning. The silence returned, heavy and unbroken, wrapping around him like a shroud, a weight that pressed him into the earth, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as they clutched the sand, its grains slipping through his fingers like time he couldn't hold. He lay there, the desert's vastness a presence that loomed over him, its stillness a mockery of the terror that still thrummed in his veins. Those tracks, that face, that hiss, the claw-scraped rock echoing in his skull like a chant he couldn't silence. Hours passed, or minutes, he couldn't tell. The night stretching into a timeless void where the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to his survival. His breath steadied, slow and shallow, the air cool now against his sweat-soaked skin, the heat of the day a memory that lingered in the ache of his muscles. He forced himself up, limbs heavy as stone, and limped back toward the trailhead, the distant silhouette of his truck a beacon in his memory, its rusted frame a promise of escape he clung to like a lifeline. The desert watched, its silence a weight that followed him, the sand whispering beneath his boots with every step, a soft hiss that mimicked the creature's breath, a sound that turned his head more than once, eyes straining against the dark for a shape that never came. The Joshua trees loomed like sentinels, their branches casting shadows that twisted into grotesque forms, Claws, limbs, a hunched silhouette, tricks of the mind he couldn't shake, each one a jolt that quickened his pulse until he reached the gravel lot, the truck's familiar outline an anchor in the chaos. He fumbled the keys from his pocket, hands shaking so hard they slipped twice before finding the lock, the metallic clank of the door a sound that grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl that drowned the silence, and he peeled out, tires spitting gravel as the desert receded in his rearview mirror. A blur of black and sand he refused to look at too long. The mirror of void he feared might hold those eyes, that face, watching him still. Dawn found him in Borrego Springs, a speck of a town where the streets were little more than dust tracks lined with squat buildings, their windows dark and shuttered against the morning chill. He stumbled into a diner, its neon sign flickering open in a sickly green glow, the air inside thick with grease and the faint hum of a radio, and collapsed into a booth, his clothes torn, his hands crusted with sand and blood, his voice a rasp as he ordered coffee he didn't drink, the mug trembling in his grip. Days later, he pieced together fragments from locals over chipped mugs and wary glances. The cave tied to a smuggler's network decades old, abandoned tunnels threading beneath the park like veins in a dying body, stories of mutilated livestock left in grotesque displays, cows with ribs splayed, sheep torn apart and abandoned, hikers vanishing into the sand, their packs found shredded, their fates whispered in bars and gas stations, dismissed as desert myths, the ravings of sunstruck minds or drunks chasing shadows. He reported it to the park rangers, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and they investigated, spurred by his shaky account. A tale they listened to with tight lips and eyes that didn't meet his. They found more than he'd seen. Human bones scattered deep inside the cave, gnawed clean, piled with a precision that spoke of intent, not hunger, some dating back decades. Their surfaces etched with faint claw marks, others fresher, their marrow stripped bare, the air thick with that metallic stench he'd never forget. They never found the creature, their searches yielding only shadows and silence, tracks erased by wind, the cave's depths a labyrinth that swallowed their lights and their courage alike. Grant doesn't map trails anymore. The desert he loved betrayed him, its lines rewritten by something that defies the maps he once trusted, its silence a lie that hid a hunger he can't unsee. He's read the theories, cryptids, mutations, desert-adapted predators twisted by isolation and time, but none fit, none explain that hiss, those claws, the deliberate malice in its gaze, the way it tore flesh not to eat but to destroy. Locals whispered of older things, Paiute tales of spirits born from the earth's wrath, vengeful and eternal, guardians of a hollow world beneath the sand. Or perhaps something simpler, a predator science hadn't named, a relic of a time when the desert was a sea, its hunger preserved in the dark like a fossil waiting to wake. He can't say if it's folklore or truth, can't pin a name to the thing that haunts his sleep, its face a smear of pale and black behind his lids, its hiss a sound that wakes him in the night, sweat-soaked and gasping, the wind outside his window a mimic he can't trust. What haunts him isn't the name. It's the certainty that it waits, its tracks erased by wind, its den a void beneath the sand, its hunger patient and unending, a presence that knows his scent, that marked him in the silence of that ravine. He keeps the notebook, its pages curled and stained, a single sketch scratched into its final leaf, a clawed hand, too long, too wrong, the lines trembling where his pencil faltered. The ranger's report called it inconclusive, a tidy fiction that buried the bones and the truth beneath bureaucracy and dust. But Grant knows better. The desert isn't empty. It's alive, its hollow earth echoing with a hunger that doesn't sleep, a pale shadow that moves when the wind falls still. This one man, Grant's descent into the desert's pale hunger, carves a map of the unseen. Tracks too deep, bones piled, caves whispering dread. A beast? A spirit? A relic of the hollow earth? What would you do, hearing that hiss, feeling those tracks form around you in the silence? Could you walk that desert and sleep soundly after, knowing what echoes beneath its veins? The abyss waits, its hunger a shadow that never fades.